What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, we got a good one for you guys. In today's video, we're going to be going over the top 5 wide receivers that you should have drafted. With most people's drafts already being completed and football ready to take place this upcoming week, many of us are going to be looking at the rosters that we left the draft with and wondering if we made the right decisions. Well, in this video, we'll be going over 5 wide receivers that we believe you guys should have drafted. It's not a death sentence if you didn't get any of these players on any of your fantasy rosters, but keep an eye out on these players throughout the season because not only do we think that they're going to have strong production, but we also believe they were coming in at good values in the draft. But before we do get into the video, just a quick shout out and reminder that if you do enjoy these videos, show your support by hitting that like button, and to make sure you don't miss out on any of our uploads, follow along by subscribing to the channel. We're on the road to 100k subscribers, and with your help, we definitely can make that a reality. With that being said though, it's time to hop over to our stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was 4 quarterbacks had at least 90 rushing yards in a game last season: Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, Kyler Murray, and which was the 4th quarterback? The correct answer was actually Daniel Jones. Congratulations to Gerard Roberts, the first to get this right on YouTube. And as for Twitter, at RedLeader101529. Once again, congratulations to both of you. But let's see who can get today's stat of the day right. Which quarterback lost the most yards in a single game last season from sacks alone? Once again, that's which quarterback in 2020 lost the most yards in a single game last season due to sacks. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Alright guys, without further ado, let's hop right into the video. And I felt for this video what we should do is to go in different stages of the draft. So the first wide receiver will be an elite one, somebody selected within the top 5 at the position. Compare them to some of the other wide receivers around them. Then we'll go into a bit later the wide receiver 2 range. After that, we'll go into the wide receiver 3s, so on and so forth until we get through the top 5. We'll begin with the wide receiver 1, that elite wide receiver, and we believe the strongest at the position definitely has to be Calvin Ridley. And no, I don't mean pound for pound he's going to be the best wide receiver, that he's going to finish as the wide receiver 1 or should be drafted as the wide receiver 1. That spot does belong to Davante Adams, but when you compare draft stock into it, because Davante Adams does require a first round pick in order to land him on your roster in most cases, Calvin Ridley being drafted in the 2nd round in different stages of the 2nd round. I've seen some drafts where he's gone in the early 2nd round, others where he's fallen to the back of the 2nd round, and that's largely on the back of the different rankings between different people. Currently, Calvin Ridley is coming off the board as the 4th wide receiver, Davante Adams, as we had mentioned, coming off the board first, going into Tyreek Hill, then Stephon Diggs, Calvin Ridley with an average draft position as the 4th off the board at the wide receiver position. Some people may also opt to draft DeAndre Hopkins ahead of him, so Calvin Ridley is coming in at a value, and considering we are extremely high on Calvin Ridley, we've ranked him as high as the wide receiver 2. Having the ability to pair Calvin Ridley, a player who can finish as the top overall wide receiver in all of fantasy, with one of those elite running back options, the best to finish first in their position, running backs like Dalvin Cook, Christian McCaffrey, Kamara, thinking you have the ability to leave the draft with that type of combination, it should almost be looked at as a cheat code. Wondering why he made this list from a value perspective, that should answer any questions you may have. From a talent perspective, I think we all can agree that Calvin Ridley has the juice. He's a first-round wide receiver. He's also coming off a season where, appearing in 15 games and receiving 143 targets, he converted that into 90 receptions, 1,374 receiving yards to go along with 9 touchdowns. That was a season where he had Julio Jones lining up across him. Julio Jones, while banged up for most of the season, still did appear in 9 total games. Calvin Ridley playing some of his best games and having some of his best fantasy performances in the games where Julio Jones was absent from the lineup. And what that tells us is, with Julio Jones now a Tennessee Titan, Calvin Ridley, if he does appear in 15 games as he did last season, he should easily be able to meet or exceed the numbers he put up last season. With him finishing already inside the top 5 at the position last season, only playing on a grand total of 79.2% of snaps, that actually ranked 33rd at the wide receiver position, it's a guarantee he's in line for more snaps, more volume, more fantasy production as a whole. And with him being on the Atlanta Falcons offense, it's one of the safest offenses we could ask ask for at the wide receiver position. They give up a ton of points. They're likely to rank in the bottom 10 in that area. It's a very strong possibility that in many of their games, they're going to be playing catch up. A lot of garbage time opportunities also present themselves. And even when looking at the backfield, a position of need heading into the offseason and into the draft, they really didn't do all that much to solve it besides signing an elder running back, Mike Davis, who has been a journeyman and a backup at best. He did do well in the absence of Christian McCaffrey, but expecting him to be the solution for the long term or even for this entire year is going to be a bit of a long shot. Calvin Ridley, he's primed for a great season. He's a wide receiver that we feel confident drafting in that stage of the draft, and when comparing the value of the receivers around him to what you get with Ridley, we think he's easily the best option. Moving over to the wide receiver 2 that we chose for this video, it's actually going to be a player that you can almost draft as a wide receiver 3. At least he's falling outside the top 20 in many leagues. His ADP being a massive reason that he made this list. It's Cooper Kupp of the Los Angeles Rams. Circling back to the ADP and the value aspect of drafting Cooper Kupp, this is a player that you can easily draft in the 4th round. He's actually falling as far as the 5th round in some leagues, currently actually coming in with the best value in ESPN, coming in 45th overall, which translates to one of the final picks in the 4th round. If any of your league mates decide to reach on a tight end or a quarterback, or maybe another wide receiver or running back projected to be drafted behind Cooper Kupp, in those cases, it's not uncommon whatsoever for Cooper Kupp to find his way to the 5th round. That means teams can easily go RB heavy in the early stages of the draft, draft Cooper Kupp still as a running back too, and be able to have an elite quarterback or tight end, or even both if you wanted to trust Cooper Kupp as your wide receiver 1. Trusting Cooper Kupp as a wide receiver 1 isn't as risky as actually meets the eye. Yes, he's coming off of a subpar season last year, but we have to remember he was recovering from an ACL tear. This was largely the reason we were a bit down on him, a bit higher on Robert Woods. But even in a season where the LA Rams offense was down as a whole, the actual worst performance that the offense has had under Sean McVay since he's began coaching that team, and as mentioned, Kupp himself recovering from an ACL tear, his first time back in action since, he still finished as the wide receiver 30 in fantasy points per game, appearing in 15 total, so he was available for your team for most of the season. So starting him as a flex player, he was somebody you could rely on for the entire season. On top of that, similar to his counterpart Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp actually played an extremely consistent version of his game. Typically, Kupp isn't looked at as that safe, steady Eddie type of guy. He's more looked at as the player who has those big games, maybe some of those valleys, those smaller games, but in 2020, he was pretty consistent, only actually performing single-digit fantasy points in 5 games. Many of his games over 14 fantasy points, even some cracking the 20s, so he was playing extremely consistently. He didn't see the high end of his production, but heading into this season, there is a lot more to love about him. For starters, we should expect offensive improvement with the offense moving away from Jared Goff and bringing in Matthew Stafford. On top of that, Cam Akers, the running back who is projected to lead this offense, the early down bruiser, a running back that you could really run the clock out late in games. He's gone. They replaced him with Sony Michel. It will be a lot more difficult to have the same success in the end game simply by running out the clock with your running back if Sony Michel is your only option. Don't get me wrong, Darrell Henderson definitely could do that himself, but with him being on the smaller size, limiting his workload is definitely going to be a factor. So if we couple those two reasons with the fact that Cooper Kupp himself is already finished as a top 5 wide receiver in 2 different seasons, one in 2019, then again in the year before that in 2018, his sophomore season, where he didn't play in a full season, only appearing in 8 games, but if you took his fantasy points per game, he was right up there with that top 5 wide receiver average. Projecting Cooper Kupp out for another top 20 season, top 15 season, potentially top 10 season isn't a bold take whatsoever. He's also coming in a stage of the draft where none of the other wide receivers around him have the same type of upside nor consistency. On top of that, he's falling in drafts, so Cooper Kupp for us as a back-end wide receiver 2 pick is a no-brainer wide receiver we think everybody's going to regret not drafting. Alright guys, we're moving into the third player on this list. This is going to be the wide receiver in that wide receiver 3 range. Some of you may consider this a cop-out because I'm going to make this a combo pick. It's 2 players from the same team, but they're actually being drafted at nearly the same ADP, and depending on which league you're in is going to determine which one's drafted higher than the other. That's exactly why they're nearly going back-to-back in drafts, so if one of them falls, that's the one I would opt for you to choose. In the 2 wide receivers we have are Jeudy and Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. We personally are a bit higher on Jeudy. He's heading into his sophomore season after what many could consider a disappointing rookie campaign. He's a first round draft talent. He's also not coming off of an ACL tear like his counterpart Courtland Sutton, but don't get me wrong, we're not extremely low on Sutton either. Where they're going in the draft, each one of them has an easy shot to pay off their draft price. Starting off with Courtland Sutton though, I believe he is the less desirable option of the two based on ADP. Our personal preference, he first broke out onto the scene in his sophomore season, appearing in 16 games, finishing as the wide receiver 19 in PPR leagues, wide receiver 17 in standard leagues. That was on the back of 124 targets, 72 receptions, 1,112 receiving yards, and even caught himself 6 receiving touchdowns. In that season, he could be found in fantasy drafts as a late round option. So for many people, Courtland Sutton was one of those wide receivers who carried your team. You put him in the flex, he graduated to your wide receiver 2. He hardly disappointed, and he was playing in all games. For that, many people were very high on him. He was a top 20 pick at the wide receiver position the season after that in 2020. Some drafts he was even pushing for the top 12 at the position, so Courtland Sutton was undeniably a hot target in that offseason. Unfortunately for him, and possibly fortunate for him, he did tear his ACL in week 1. It's not fortunate that he tore his ACL, but the fact that it happened in the first week, that gives him an extremely long recovery time. That means heading into this season, he will be a bit better off than someone like Kupp, who tore his ACL so late into the season. With his recovery timetable being so high and a new quarterback, Teddy Bridgewater, set to start for the Denver Broncos, Courtland Sutton is going to have a fair opportunity to compete to lead this team in targets. And regardless if that happens or not, he has an easy shot at exceeding his draft day price tag. So when people look back at the draft and seeing who they got as a good value, I believe many people will think of Courtland Sutton as a good pick in that range. As for Jeudy, as mentioned, he's heading into that same sophomore season where we saw the breakout from Courtland Sutton. As mentioned, receivers nowadays, they're breaking out a lot earlier than they had in the past. Typically, we were waiting for that miraculous third year for a wide receiver where we typically saw the breakouts. But for these talented guys who get in and step into an early opportunity, wide receivers like Jeudy, not only having 1 year under his belt, but also dealing with a lot of adversity in that season, a lot of volume in that season as well, he is the perfect example of someone you could point to for a potential upcoming breakout. Unfortunately for him, I don't think many people could consider last season a breakout performance for him. He finished as the wide receiver 47 that year, despite receiving a whopping 113 targets, which is one of the main factors why he's falling in drafts. On those 113 targets, Jeudy only caught 52 of them. He also didn't produce all that well from an efficiency standpoint, 856 receiving yards, and only caught himself 3 receiving touchdowns. If you were to tell us heading into last year's fantasy draft that he would receive that type of volume, I think many people would be extremely high on him and very disappointed with what he put up, finishing 6th in air yards, 19th in average target distance, 7th in deep targets, and like I mentioned, 47th for fantasy. A massive reason for his inefficiency though was solved this offseason with the team signing Teddy Bridgewater, who is now projected to start. Teddy Bridgewater, we already know, he supported 3 fantasy relevant wide receivers, so it wouldn't be uncommon for both Jeudy and Courtland Sutton to have fantasy value and be good values where they're falling in drafts. Bridgewater himself, also one of the most accurate quarterbacks when we're talking short and intermediate routes. He didn't take many deep shots, but hopefully that's something he can fix this season, because that's definitely going to be one of the ways where Jeudy completely dominates for this upcoming year. Either way though, Jeudy and Courtland Sutton, they're primed to produce, and considering you can draft them in the mid to back end wide receiver 3 range, 2 players that are definitely falling, and like I said, one typically falls a bit later than the other. These are players you can easily get at values, potentially in that flex wide receiver 4 range. So if you ask us, they're definitely going to be a wide receiver tandem that a lot of people will regret not drafting. Moving into the 4th player, arguably one of my favorite picks in the draft, but unfortunately this is also a player climbing. It's Laviska Shenault of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He finds himself on an ascending team when we're talking offense. First overall draft pick, Trevor Lawrence, now the starting quarterback for their team. It's going to be a big upgrade. Last season they had Gardner Minshew. We know Minshew mania was a real thing, but Gardner Minshew last season didn't look as good as he did the year before, even being benched for Mike Glennon, a journeyman at best. So it's safe to say that we didn't get the best out of Gardner Minshew. The team felt comfortable with trading him to the Philadelphia Eagles for virtually nothing. So heading into this year, we should expect a lot better production out of that area. And Laviska Shenault himself, some people have even made the argument that he is the most talented wide receiver on that roster. That could be considered a bold take for some, not so much others. But whenever you're on a team with Marvin Jones, a receiver who's who's produced top numbers both in Cincinnati with Andy Dalton, scoring double-digit touchdowns with that team, then having himself a super solid and underrated career over with the Detroit Lions before making his way over to Jacksonville. Comparing Laviska's talent to his is pretty high praise, but potentially even higher praise when compared to the athleticism of DJ Chark, a receiver who himself finished within the top 20 for fantasy, but since then he's been battling injuries, playing inconsistently, which paves the way and the question if Laviska Shenault could be the top scoring wide receiver for the Jacksonville Jaguars this upcoming season. One thing working in his favor was the season-ending injury to Travis Etienne, a running back that was drafted to play in the short and intermediate passing game, a running back that Trevor Lawrence is all too familiar with playing on the same team at college under the same offense. With him now not able to compete this season, Laviska Shenault is looked at as a receiver who's going to be soaking up much of that production, which means when it comes to his volume and the consistency of him, this is going to be an area that we see increasing over what was originally expected. One thing working in his favor though is that even though he did increase his draft day value, he's still coming in at a good price tag, certainly a spot where he can return value for anyone drafting him. You're also not going to be assuming all that much risk by adding him to your roster because he's somebody that's going in a stage of the draft where he's only going to be expected to be a bench player. With him not being required to start in week 1, you can feel out the situation between those 3 competing wide receivers, making sure that Laviska is playing consistently enough for you to trust him. Having that luxury could pay dividends, and with a rookie quarterback, somebody who's expected to get better as the season progresses, Laviska Shenault, even if he rides your bench for the first several weeks, he's someone you can trust as a spot start, someone you can play in a good matchup. But much like Trevor Lawrence himself playing some of his best football as the season progresses, we can easily see Laviska Shenault following in that same pathway, with the fantasy playoffs being late in the season and us having to perform our best as we inch closer to the playoffs, locking in our playoff spot, drafting players and rostering players who are trending upward as the season progresses. It's easily one of the most important factors contributing to success in the fantasy playoffs. For those reasons, Laviska, high on our draft board, someone you can draft in that wide receiver 4 territory. We wouldn't recommend drafting him on ESPN though. He's actually coming off the board 55th overall, but if you're playing on any other platform, we're talking Yahoo, NFL, Sleeper, FFPC, this is a player falling outside the top 80. At that draft spot, Laviska Shenault is a no-brainer selection, so it's no wonder why he made this top 5 list. Alright guys, we're moving into the final player in today's video. It's going to be a receiver you can draft with one of your final picks. This is going to be that late round flyer, the guy that may not pay off, and compared to the other wide receivers being drafted around them, the expectation isn't for them to pay off. We like to draft players who we can instantly pick up, drop in the first few weeks for a hot player off waiver wire if we know their season isn't panning out the way we planned. And the final wide receiver we have today is Jakobi Meyers of the New England Patriots. This has been someone we've been extremely high on throughout this offseason, even back when Cam Newton was the projected starter for this offense, and that's really saying something because Cam Newton himself is someone who just completely diminishes the fantasy value for all of the skill players around him. At least that's what takes place in this stage of his career. Damian Harris, Jonnu Smith, Jakobi Meyers, these are all players you can draft in fantasy that we think have increased value with the news that Mac Jones will be starting. Mac Jones is having a very solid rookie season based off what we've seen in the preseason. The New England Patriots themselves felt confident enough to drop Cam Newton, not even keep him as a backup, so that just goes to show you the amount of confidence that they have in Mac Jones, and the Patriots organization from a coaching standpoint, they typically do a good job. So with the team fully backing Mac Jones, that should give us a bit of excitement for players including Jakobi Meyers. Currently, the earliest Jakobi Meyers is falling off the board in any platform is ESPN, but even in that platform, he's coming 119th overall. On the other platforms, he can be taken and found outside the top 150. Even looking at Sleeper, where surprisingly he's coming in at the best value, and I would say that's probably the second most common platform that many of you watching this video are playing on, he was coming off the board 176th overall. That's behind many kickers, many defenses, so Jakobi Meyers likely could have been drafted with your very last pick, and getting a player who could even potentially crack your flex spot if you're getting them outside the top 170, that is in incredible value. Like I mentioned though, dropping him isn't going to feel all that painful with that type of investment, but the type of production you could potentially get from Jakobi Meyers isn't even limited to a flex player. Even looking back to last season, there was a point in time where Jakobi Meyers was relied on to move the chains between the 20s. In those games, he received 10 targets, 14 targets alike. That's a massive target share and a possible target share we see appear itself again this season. Yes, there's more competition, but none of them established. Jakobi Meyers has just as much of a chance as any other receiver on this team to lead this team in receiving, lead them in targets, and in those games where he received that type of target share, 14 targets, 12 receptions, 169 receiving yards. The other game where he received 10 targets, he only converted 6 of them into receptions for 58 yards, but it was a much better passing defense in the Buffalo Bills. So if Meyers in this upcoming season is able to put together anything similar than he did last season when he was receiving that heavy target market share, he's easily going to smash his ADP, potentially be a wide receiver you could trust as your wide receiver 2, easily a high upside option you put in your flex. And considering the team moved away from Cam Newton over to Mac Jones, somebody who is going to be a much better and more efficient passer, what Jakobi Meyers did with that amount of targets last season may not even be what he does this upcoming year. There's a lot more room for upside. It's very likely if he receives that same type of target market share, the production we get out of him is going to be that much higher. And if it's not working out, if you draft him and Jakobi Meyers is receiving virtually no targets, he's not playing on a high amount of snaps for some of the other receivers this team added this offseason, then in that case, you cut him, you dropped him. But if you get him outside the top 150, outside the top 170, you really didn't lose much to begin with. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. Thank you all for watching. Catch you on the next one.